This here is a 24-pin cable. Well, I mean, it's going to be. As of right now, it has no pins or a connector on either side. And this is for an NZXT power supply, the C850. One thing you'll notice is that if you've been doing some cable slaving, you'll notice that there's 23 wires on the 24-pin on this side that plugs into the motherboard. And then there are sometimes upwards of like 28 pins on the power supply end. And the reason for that is that you have these double wires, well, they're really splits in this case. Sometimes motherboard stock power supplies do them as split wires, but you can get away with just doing split wires because they supply the same amount of power. So what this is basically this. So we've got two wires that join into one. So this is how the ATX 24-pin cable has more pins on one side than the other. Most of the time you'll see this on the PCIe and the ATX 24-pin. I'll be showing both how to do the split. For 24 pins, you want it to split off from two wires going into the power supply into one wire going into the motherboard. It'll just make it cleaner. And then for PCIe cables, you want it going from one cable from the power supply out to two long wires for PCIe, because that'll make that cleaner. And today I'm going to show you how I do these splits and the method I use for ensuring that they are very, very secure. So I actually don't even solder at all. So let's get into it. To start off, you're going to want to have a set wire length for your cable, and you're going to want to make sure you measure with the same wire. I would not recommend measuring out on a ruler for every cable. I would only recommend that for the first cable length, because your method of measuring on a ruler might vary every now and then, and you want to make this as consistent as possible. You want to have a tolerance of about less than 1 millimeter for every single cable, or wire rather. So that way it's nice and straight. If you get like even 1 millimeter too long, sometimes you'll see like cables looking like this, where some of the wires fan out when you put the connectors and pins on. So it's ideal that you have a tolerance of less than 1 millimeter for each wire. And if you cut it off from the spool, the wire, of course, if you cut the wire off from the spool and it's longer, no problem, just trim it till it's perfectly the right length. And then if it's too short, you just gotta do it again and put that other wire aside, use it for something else, recycle it, do something. Just don't use it in your cable because it will ruin the look. So starting with your wire, so you want to I've marked this out as my first wire with a piece of tape, as you can see. So I know that this is the wire I use for, this one specifically is the one I use for my 24-pin cables. It is exactly 26 inches. That's roughly about, I think, 600 millimeters to be exact. So you want to measure out across, make sure they're aligned on both sides. It's always better to cut more than you need than not enough, because you always trim it. I always add extra length and then trim it down. Now we've got a wire. And for motherboard ATX, what I like to do is measure off I do the same thing with the split wire, or the wire that splits out from the main wire. So this is measured at 4 inches. So what we want to do is cut out another wire that is exactly 4 inches, like this one. So you just do the same thing that you did before, being careful to make sure you get the exact length, or as close to it as humanly possible. This is the circular big Molex pins for 4-pin Molex power. What I do is take some pliers. These are my wire cutters, but they have a plier on the end, and I just squish the pin, the circular part, in to be flat. That'll help me for this next step when I want to crimp that onto the contact of the split. So what you want to do now is measure on the wire here. You want to measure to 4 inches, or about 10 centimeters. And then you want to put a little, you know, make sure you have your finger on it or mark it with something, like put an imprint on it. So it's right there. Now you take your wire cutters, make sure you're picking the right setting for whatever gauge wire you're using, and then you just clamp it down. These ones don't have a spring, they're really cheap, they were like less than $5. So then about a 1/4 of an inch or about 1 centimeter away. Sometimes I like to do less than a centimeter. What the fuck was that? Whatever. So about a 1/4 of an inch away, you do it again. Now I take an X-Acto knife and I slowly cut along the wire in between those two cuts. You don't want to cut that way. Obviously you need to cut like that. You want to go slowly and gradually. Once you've got your cut in there, you just take your fingernail and you peel through the center of that cut and peel off the insulation, this one little bit. What you should be left with is that, 4 inches away from one end. Then we'll strip that wire, and normally I strip this a little bit longer than, and it can be rough, so I use these strippers. So I strip it a little bit longer than if I was crimping a pin on. Then I like to just twist the wire. This will make it easier for inserting into the pin. We grab our flattened Molex pin. As you see, it has been flattened, except for the crimps. The crimps are not flattened. They are still intact. You're gonna want it to be on the part that plugs, or that is wired as one wire. So it should look like that when we crimp it. So that's where it goes. Now you just grab your crimpers. This is gonna be a little hard to show. You just crimp it. Then it should look just like that. Where, like that. Now what you do is you take the extra part of the pin that you didn't use. I like to just break it off by metal stress, by twisting it back and forth. You can throw that away. And then what you want to do is take your heat shrink, 3:1, 1/4 inch, and you'll put that over that crimp. But first, before you do that, give it a little tug. Make sure it's nice and strong. In this case it is. So now we have our split wire. And you do the same thing for the PCIe, except you make the split run along the 2 long wires. So instead of it being this way, it'll be, the wire will be running that way. That's how you do the split wires. It's very simple once you get the hang of it. And once you get the workflow down, you can do it very easily without any failures, really. So, yeah. That's how the split wires go. And then to sleeve over this, you would just sleeve all the way up. I always like to sleeve up to... I sleeve the single wire first, normally. And then I'll sleeve up to about here where the heat shrink stops. And then I'll sleeve on the double wire all the way up to the V. So right where it splits, in the middle. Then you put the heat shrink over. I personally would recommend getting heat shrink that has adhesive on the inside, so that when it melts, when you melt the heat shrink, well, shrink the heat shrink by heating it, you don't melt it in this case, it will have that adhesive grip onto that sleeve, and then you don't have to worry about it pulling loose from stress. So yeah, and then you always want to make sure you put the heat shrink on over the bare wire first, because you don't know where the heat shrink is going to be once you have the sleeving over it. So always do that. It's a risk if you don't, of a potential short and damaging components, because if you short this wire, it could send, well, actually, if you short a 12-volt wire into your case, that could create a fire hazard for the wire, because that 12-volt plus ground is never good. So always put sleeve over any crimp, solder, bare wire, anything. Always do it. And then sleeve over the insulation, or the heat shrink, and then put another piece of heat shrink if you have to. It's always better to be safe than sorry. You wouldn't want to have your expensive graphics card or expensive motherboard or just your house go up in flames because you didn't do this. So please always put heat shrink on wherever you see a contact point. Alright? So, thanks for watching. I will talk to you guys later.